welfare Slack workspace. So this is the first time we actually switched from weekly to bi-weekly webinars. So I'm really happy to see that so many of you tuning in today. So before we start, it would be great if everyone could help me just double check your mic is on mute and your camera is turned off. And please type your questions in the chat box and we can go through them at the end of the talk. So today we have Dr. Ellen Williams with us tonight. So Ellen just finished her PhD last year and she's currently a lecturer at Nottingham Trent University. Her PhD thesis is on captive elephant welfare and she's an expert in zoo animal behavior. I still remember back in 2017, we were both still PhD students. We did an animal behavior welfare walks and talks together, and she gave a very interesting talk about the story of elephants in the Belfast Zoo. So today we're really happy to have her with us and to talk about social relationships of zoo elephant. So the floor is yours, Ellen. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Jen. And thanks everybody else for coming along today on bank holiday. I appreciate the garden's probably more appealing, but yeah, hopefully it's an okay talk. So yeah, I'm going to be talking to you about zoo elephants and trying to understand a little bit more about factors that affect the relationships that they have within the kind of the confines of a zoo environment, which is obviously very different to what they'd be experiencing in the wild. Oops. Oh. Oh, here we go. Okay, so in terms of just social groups as a whole, they can range from sort of relatively static through to fission fusion, which means that group sizes and structures might kind of change over periods of time or when there's different resources available and things. Social groups can be really complex, and there's a potential for lots of individuals within a social group to have kind of different levels of relationships. But it's really important that a social group is within a zoo is functional. And this kind of need for a functional social group is considered a sort of a primary welfare concern really for a lot of species, and one of the most important factors that are affecting welfare in some species. So kind of suboptimal or inappropriate social groups can lead to sort of a variety of situations. They might lead to increased performance of abnormal behaviors, reduced reproductive success. If individuals are just not getting on, then they're not going to be mating, potentially excessive aggression, and all this can lead to physical illness as well. So there's lots of kind of negatives. On the flip side, if we get our social groups right, it's really important for animals. It can be really beneficial to their welfare. And what we see if we've got these kind of social groups of appropriate complexity is sort of an array of species-specific behaviours, enhanced opportunity for learning. So this is particularly important in younger animals. This opportunity for play and a sense of companionship and security. And you know, if something happens within an environment, it's really important that animals have got that sort of that network to be kind of comfortable. It can also lead to reduced abnormal behaviours. They can sort of link to the companionship and security really. We know that they can sort of potentially buffer some stresses that an animal might be having, and they can lead to all-in improved welfare. But there's lots of different factors affecting the success of social groups, and this includes things like providing animals with choice of social partners, so giving them the opportunity to kind of seek out individuals that they may want to spend time with or spend less time with. Past individual experiences as well. So as anybody that's done sort of zoo research or has worked in zoos knows, there's going to be lots of individual experiences are going to have happened previously, and that's going to impact on how they are in their current situation. Also, sort of group size and composition affects the social group, obviously. Position in the social hierarchies. If you've got hierarchical species, where an individual sits within that hierarchy is going to be really important for its experience. And then also things like individual compatibility and personality as well. So we'll be talking a little bit more about personality shortly. So I suppose just really to sort of kind of talk about why, if social groups are, you know, the be all and end all for animals in zoos, why are we not just giving them these perfect social groups all the time? And I guess there's a few reasons. There's sort of practical problems, so, you know, maybe space restrictions or financial constraints, but actually there's also things like we might just not know enough about the animal, the species that we're dealing with. So, you know, in some instances we know a lot about what they do in the wild, but does that always necessarily translate over into a zoo environment where there's, you know, there's different stresses and there's different things acting on the animal. You know, they've got plenty of food, but then they've got visitors, so, you know, we've got different things happening for them. Sometimes it can be difficult as well to just truly replicate the natural interaction. So if you've got a species, and I'll use elephants as an example because we're going to be talking about them more today, but if you've got a species like an elephant that's, you know, it's very big and needs a lot of space and actually engages in these kind of changes in group size, well, we can't just let the elephants trot off down the road to the next zoo to kind of go and find another group to spend time with. So, you know, there are some practical considerations taken to think about as well. Compatibility as well. So compatibility is difficult, and I guess it's difficult because it can change over time, and the social needs of an individual can change over time as well. So as an animal ages, or, you know, if it's a reproducing female, or, you know, a young animal, there's all different things that they need. Obviously, studbook recommendations, we need to make sure that we're kind of sending animals to where they need to go as part of the studbook program. And then that can make it difficult as well to keep these sort of stable social groups. And then lastly is potential harm from social enrichment, or, you know, introduction of new individuals, really. So we can have issues potentially with dominance or injury, and even disease transmission as well. So I guess it's critically important for welfare that we're kind of understanding social relationships in social species, and how zoos are, or how zoo environments are kind of acting on those relationships. But it's not as easy as just popping the animals together and that's your perfect social group. So I touched on personality just now. So personality is defined as individual differences which are thought to be stable across time and situations. It's really individual, it develops over lifetime, and it shapes individual experiences. It's been used a lot in zoos, and it's kind of gaining a lot of traction in zoo management. It's been used to help improve mating success in cheetah and giant pandas, and it's also been used to kind of predict friendship in chimpanzees. And I guess what I kind of want to know is, can we use it in the same way for elephants? So can we use it as a predictor of potential compatibility, of potential friendships? So to quickly kind of introduce you to elephant species, I'm sure you guys are all familiar, but within the UK and Irish zoos, we've got African savanna and Asian elephants. So they're the two species that I'm going to be talking about today. So elephants, they're really intelligent, and they're highly social. If any of you guys have been watching the series with Levison Wood, where he's been tracking elephants, you know, you can see there's lots of different group sizes and things. And this can kind of range from quite small groups up to really quite large. They display strong affiliative bonds, and they live, as I've mentioned earlier, in this sort of fission-fusion society. So the smallest groups that they have are family groups, which might be like a couple of related females and their offspring. Bond groups are larger groups with more individuals, and then clans obviously are the really big groups that come together. Now, there's lots of different factors which drive wild elephant social behaviour, and includes sort of seasonality, distribution of resources or habitat availability, and human threat level as well. So there's lots of different things kind of driving those social groups. But we tend to, despite those kind of driving factors not necessarily being present in a zoo, we sort of anchor our elephant management guidelines on wild elephant social behaviour, and we look at that as our kind of sort of gold standard, as it were. So historically, there's been sort of lots of concerns surrounding zoo elephant welfare. In the UK and Ireland, there's a report from 2002 and then a report from 2006, where basically we're saying that, you know, elephants, we can't particularly cater well for their social needs. They're held in unnatural or small social groups. They're potentially socially isolated. They're not related necessarily. And there's this potential for incompatibility. I guess to kind of bring it to present day, the majority of the elephants that were in my study group were actually sort of captive bred elephants, and you know, we've got lots of related individuals, we've got breeding herds, and then the elephants that are unrelated are elephants that are not breeding for whatever reason, you know. And so it's quite a different picture to what it was all that time ago when there were these issues around catering for social needs. Social groups have been considered as one of the most important things to kind of get right in elephant management. And I think that's really important, and hopefully research like this sort of helps to kind of advance what we know about elephant social groups in the scientific literature. So in terms of management guidelines, the current guidelines recommend that when elephants are breeding, they should be kept in matriarchal herds, that they should have a minimum group size of 4 cows over the age of 2. Unrestricted physical contact should be maximised, so wherever possible, elephants should be having unrestricted physical contact. And there should be these individual welfare plans where it's like this sort of plan is laid out for each elephant in the collection. And zoos are really working towards this kind of common goal of improving the resemblance of zoo elephants' social structures to wild elephants where possible and appropriate, and kind of aiming for these sort of, you know, obviously compatible herds, and sort of thinking about the collection that they have got. So the aim of this work, well, this was the aim of my entire PhD actually, was to enhance the understanding, enhance our understanding of factors affecting these zoo elephant social relationships in UK and Irish zoos. So I had 32 elephants in total and 7 wonderful study zoos who were extremely accommodating and very kind to me over the entire period of my PhD. I didn't have a 50-50 split on African and Asian elephants. I had more Asian elephants than African elephants. And I had no African elephant calves, which I think is important to bear in mind. So I looked at social interactions, and I used 30-second scan sampling. And I did this because a lot of my stuff was on videos, and so what I'd find was that there'd be no elephants on the screen, and then all of a sudden all of the elephants on the screen, sorry, excuse me, and I didn't know who was who, and I didn't know what the nature of the interaction was. So just having this 30 seconds gave me that little break to work that out. And I collected data over a period of 12 months, but for each study zoo I went once a week for 8 months over this period of 12 months. And within that 1 week, I looked at 24 hours of footage. So I collected quite a lot of data. And then I wanted to think about what were my kind of factors of interest. What did I want to know more about, and what did I want to see, you know, what its kind of impact was on the social interactions that I was seeing. And so I looked at relatedness to others, looked at age of the elephant to see if calves were different to adults, sex and species, the size of the herd. I also looked at whether whether elephants had relatives in the herd, whether there were calves in the herd, and then individual personality as well. And for the personality assessment, I sent this out to all of my study zoos, and again, my keepers were fantastic and they happily filled this form in for me. So there was 21 adjectives, and what they were asked to do was kind of rate on a scale to 0 to 10, where 0 is kind of I don't agree at all, and 10 is I completely agree, where they felt this elephant fitted on this scale, on this Likert scale. So I did intra-class correlation coefficient with the personality data to look at reliability between my keepers. and all of my reliably related terms across all of my study zoos were entered into a principal components analysis to kind of draw out themes within the personality adjectives. And then I used really simple general linear models to look at the different factors that I wanted to investigate further. So these were very simple because of the size of my data set being, for this type of analysis, relatively small. So I split my my results. So I was looking at interactions given by individual elephants, and I split them into positive and negative interactions. And then within those, I split them into physical and non-physical. And I split them because I felt that a physical interaction represented potentially a different relationship to a non-physical interaction. And so my positive behaviors, physical positive behaviors were play and sort of trunk two type behaviors, and non-physical were things like approaching another elephant or parallel walking or something that indicated some level of relationship. And then my negative behaviors, the physical ones were pushing and pulling, and non-physical were kind of negative approaches or walking away from another elephant. So trying to sort of take into account sort of displacement type behaviors as well. So these are my results. Hopefully you can see this graph. Sorry, the text has come out a little bit small. But basically what we can see here is that positive interactions were more frequent than negative interactions. And the scale up the side here is percentage of total behavior. We can also see there's a lot more variation in terms of the positive interactions than the negative interactions over here on the right. So positive interactions were significantly more frequent than negative physical or negative non-physical interactions. So this one and these two guys. And positive non-physical interactions were also greater than the two negative type of interactions. Within the negative interactions, negative non-physical interactions were more frequent than negative physical. And what we can see here is negative physical interactions took up a really, really small amount of time. Of the positive physical interactions, trunk two behaviors were the most frequent. So touching another elephant with the trunk was the most frequently observed behavior. Okay, so I mentioned I had very willing keepers who thankfully filled in my personality assessment for me. So there were 27 of them. And first of all, as I mentioned, I needed to test reliability between my keepers, and I found that 9 adjectives were reliably rated. And when I realized that this included the sociable adjective, I actually squealed with joy. I was so excited. And then I wanted to condense my individual traits into the components, so did the principal components analysis. And I pulled up these 3 components. The one we're going to be focusing on is the sociability component. So this is elephants that were described by keepers as sociable, affectionate towards elephants, and playful with other elephants as well. So on the next few slides, the pink boxes are things that did have an effect on the frequency of the interactions, and the grey slides are things that did not. So the grey, all of the boxes on the screen are things that I tested. So for the positive physical interactions, calves performed 4 times more than adults. And we need to kind of think about the fact that these are kind of reassurance or comfort seeking behaviours potentially, and there might be an increased need for tactile contact in calves. And I found that elephants with a higher sociability score, as rated by the keepers, had engaged in more positive physical interactions with other elephants, and they also engaged with a greater proportion of the herd than less sociable elephants. So that fitted nicely, which was great. And then to move on to positive non-physical interactions. So there were 3 things here that were having an effect, and that was species, relatedness, and the presence of calves. So it was 3 times lower when there was no calves in the herd. When there was, when we're looking at relatedness between individuals, it was 3 times higher when an elephant had relatives in the group, and it was 3 times higher between related elephants. Then onto the species. So Asian elephants engaged in more positive non-physical interactions than the African elephants. I think at this point it's really important to sort of re-highlight the fact that I didn't have any African elephant calves, and so I had very different groups. So my Asian elephants were on average larger, and like I said, they didn't have any calves in the groups in African elephants. So I think it's kind of important, and it's sort of on the to-do list really for future research to look at whether that is an effect of my different social groups, or whether there's a genuine species level difference. If there is a genuine species level difference, it's something that needs a lot more further investigation, because at the moment we've just kind of got one set of guidelines, elephant management guidelines for both species. And if we're seeing genuine species level differences, we need to be considering, okay, do we need to look at those guidelines again? And do we need to consider that African and Asian elephants have slightly different social structures in the wild? So do we need to be allowing for that within zoos? Negative physical interactions, I didn't see any significant effects at all. And as I mentioned previously, they were extremely low in number. So I kind of took this to be a sign of good welfare, because if we've got excessive aggression within our social groups, that's potentially a problem. So this absence of excessive aggression is really good. And I think it's highly likely that it's indicative of actually just really good proactive social management in terms of elephant keeping. Like with any species, the keepers know their animals best, and they might not be, if they've got, for example, two individuals that they know don't necessarily get on, they might not be running them at the same time, and things like that. So I think that's why as a whole we see very small amount of negative physical interactions, as well as this kind of pointing towards successful social, which is really nice. Negative non-physical interactions then, these were affected by a few more things. They were affected by relatedness, by age of individuals, the size of the herd, and also personality. So it was 3 times higher in related than unrelated elephants. And it's only when I came to put all this information together for this presentation that I realised that everything was surrounding the number 3. I promise it's not made up, it's just a fluke. To off-balance it, calves engaged in 10 times less than adults. So we're seeing very few negative non-physical interactions in the calves. In herd sizes, so larger herds engaged in fewer negative non-physical interactions. Again, there's the potential that this is arising from the fact that the larger herds tended to be related and they tended to be matriarchal. And as we'd expect, it was higher in less sociable elephants. We need to remember with this one that this negative non-physical interactions kind of includes displacement or a reaction to displacement. So these less sociable elephants may just be moving away from elephants that they're not so, they're not wanting to be in the company of. So, and that would come up as a negative non-physical interaction. So I guess to kind of wrap up, apologies if I've sort of rattled through this too quickly, there's a potential that there are multiple factors working together. So as I mentioned, the Asian African herds had different structures, and that's a potential caveat of this research is, that I can't drill down into that because of my sample sizes. We do know though that calves are really important. Calves are kind of considered to be sort of binding agents within elephant groups, and in the wild, calves are sometimes have been reintroduced into sort of social groups to try and help to kind of reconnect to other individuals as well. I think the kind of the trunk two behaviors and have the potential to give this kind of reassurance and comfort to elephants, and social play also helps to strengthen and build relationships. So it's something that we'd expect to see in the calves. That makes a lot of sense. Calves also sort of connect social groups through initiation of interactions. But it's really important to kind of point out at this point in time that there didn't have to be calves in the group for elephants to be showing positive interactions. and they didn't have to be related either, which is great. So unrelated non-breeding elephants were also engaging in positive social interactions, which is a sign of good welfare for those individuals. The presence of those positive relationships is really good. There's also some kind of biological significance in the results, which is nice. So negative physical interactions in the adults, that's potentially these kind of hierarchical behaviors, or displacement. So we're not seeing physical aggression because the elephants are able to sort it out between themselves. Like, okay, this is my food source. All right, sure, that's your food source. I'll move away from it, kind of thing. The reduction in interactions as the elephants aged could be kind of this reduced need for reassurance or comfort because they're in, on the whole, relatively stable social groups. Elephant moves are sort of relatively infrequent. But I think it's really important that actually we include in future a kind of a second measure in terms of social relationships, and that's association. I think the picture up on the screen sort of shows it quite nicely, is these elephants may not be necessarily kind of touching or engaging with one another, but they're all stood together, and that's a definite, that's a clear measure of some level of association. So that's something that needs inclusion in future. And I think the personality side is really interesting. It potentially plays a really pivotal role in compatibility between individuals, and I think that's something that needs drilling down into sort of further. So sort of moving forwards, and where do I want to go if and when we sort of leave lockdown, and where do I think research needs to go? I actually think that we need to find out some more information to be able to provide these kind of optimum social groups. I don't think we fully understand, at least from a research point of view, I don't think we fully understand what's necessarily driving the interactions. I think we potentially also need to look critically at legislation as well, and I mentioned that that species level difference, and we really need to know, is that a real thing? Is it a real species level difference? Because if it is, we need to start thinking about putting that into some guidelines. As I mentioned, the guidelines actually say that elephants should have individual plans, and there's this kind of long-term management plan. And I think incorporation of personality in that would be really useful. And I would really like to see or be able to do research which sort of looks at, can we use personality as a predictive tool? So before an elephant moves, can we look at, which elephant, based on personality of individuals, how do we think they're going to get on, and do they get on in the way that we might predict that they would? I also want to look at, is group size relevant? So there's a minimum group size of 4 cows over the age of 2 years, and I don't know whether we kind of need to look a little bit more at whether groups, elephants in smaller groups, and I had elephants in smaller groups than 4, so could we, is it a case of sort of looking at compatibility instead of necessarily a minimum group size? And lastly, as I just mentioned about looking at the sort of social proximity partners, is proximity kind of a proxy for social interaction partners? Because that might tell us an entirely different level of social relationships for elephants in our zoos. So I guess to kind of finish up, like why does this research matter? I think it's going to give us, or hopefully give us, like an improved knowledge of zoo elephant social relationships to some extent, and that helps us to get a bit of a greater understanding of how relationships in elephants, and also I think can be extrapolated to other social species as well. How might the zoo environment be impacting on those social relationships and on those experiences? That allows us to provide appropriate environments, and we can sort of think about using evidence-based decisions. So if we are considering moving elephants for breeding, which elephants need to be moved together? And this kind of information is stuff that keepers know, but it's about sort of documenting it and working out whether we can use it in a predictive manner as well. And then lastly, hopefully, obviously, all of this leads to improved welfare for our elephants and for other social species in zoos as well. So just to finish up, I need to thank my study zoos. I need to thank Nottingham Trent University for helping to fund this project, and to my supervisors, and also to Santander Bank for funding as well. And thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. Has anybody got any questions?
Thanks, Ellen. Thanks for the talk. I think, yeah, you've really highlighted the importance of this subject. And then, as you said, it's also going to affect, the long-term management plan of all the elephants in the zoos. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to type in to the chat box. If you are just in the middle of typing, you can either raise your hand or give me a reaction so that we know that you're still typing, so we can wait for your question to come out. I do have one first question. I'm just wondering, because you have 7 different zoos, have you actually looked at, is there a zoo difference, like different enclosure in different zoos? Is the environment having some effect on their social interaction or social behaviors?
Yeah, so there wasn't, I did look at zoo, sorry, I should have put that in as well. There wasn't a zoo level difference. I didn't look at kind of specifics of enclosures, because everything would be so different. And because I only had 7, there would be too much variability in terms of kind of, I don't know, for example, like size of enclosure or type of enclosure even, or type of management, or things like that. So yeah, but there wasn't a zoo level difference.
Sure, thanks. So we have one question from Louis. So so Louis was asking, was your personality assessment template one that has previously been used for other zoo house elephants?
No, it wasn't. Well, I guess it was, but it's one that I created for a study that I did for my master's project. Before that, no, it wasn't. That was created sort of based on discussions with keepers, and just sort of looking in the literature for. So there are other personality assessments out there, and I was trying to kind of combine things that I felt were most appropriate for UK and Irish zoos. And so for my master's, I used it, and then I got a little bit of feedback on keepers who were like, this adjective didn't make sense, or I think I completed this in a different way to what you wanted me to, kind of thing. So I took out those, and I took out a couple of things where so originally I'd had I think it was dominant, and I had a real back and forth with a reviewer on a paper as to whether dominant is a personality trait or not. And so I decided for ease for the future that I would just remove that term. So kind of based on others, but sort of new for this project.
Thank you. And then the next one is from Heather, and Heather was asking, it sounds like elephant personalities or sociability changes with age. Is there a particular age or level of maturity that an elephant needs to reach before the zoo will consider moving them to another place?
Yeah, so there's not a kind of a set age. It sort of depends. I mean, it's mostly bull elephants that move rather than the females. The females tend to stay in their herds. When they're moving the bull elephants, it tends to be based on just how the animal is behaving and how it sort of is interacting with the cows in the group as well. So if he's kind of starting to cause a little bit of friction in the herd, or is just getting too boisterous, that kind of thing, then considerations given to moving them then.
So we have more questions coming in. So the next one is from Marianne. So Marianne is asking, if calves are so important to their social structure of elephants, what do you think of the suggestion to ban breeding UK elephants as a step to phase out elephants in captivity?
Good question. So calves are important, but as my research showed, adult elephants were still engaging in positive interactions, which sort of shows that our non-breeding herds were actually getting on okay. I think the whole you know, the whole idea of sort of breeding elephants out of zoos is a much bigger question. But I don't think that the absence of calves from a herd is detrimental to welfare. I just think that calves probably, I guess in the same way that like babies at Christmas or young children at Christmas provide like exciting environments for adults, I guess it's a similar thing for elephants.
So Alisa was asking, did you find any personality factors that predict compatibility across individuals? For example, in monkeys, more timid animals pair better with more dominant animals as compared to other timid animals. And a further question is, did you find similar personality types within successful groups or more diversity in the personality types?
So the answer to the second bit of the question, I didn't look at the kind of personality types within the groups in that manner, but that would be really interesting to look at. And that the work with the monkey sounds really, really interesting, and that would be quite good to look into. The answer to the first part, off the top of my head, I'm really sorry, I can't remember the first and third component and how they related to interactions, but the what I found was that more elephants that were considered more sociable by keepers were engaging in interactions with more sociable elephants, and they were engaging in significantly less interactions with less sociable elephants. So it seemed like they were, you know, that like there might be just kind of elephants that wanted to spend more time with another elephant and wanted to engage with another elephant, and they were seeking out other kind of similar interactions and actually spending less time trying to engage with the less sociable elephants. There was a little bit in there, but it might be interesting. I looked at just the whole sociable component, but it would be interesting to look at, to kind of break down that personality data and look at it on an individual adjective basis. And I think that would be something I'd be interested in looking into.
And Alisa also has a follow-up kind of comment saying that you were talking about the issue of dominance, and she suggests that maybe you can also describe it as bold rather than dominant.
Okay, yeah, that would be good. Yeah.
And so Brian is asking that can you provide some insight into the decision to label certain behaviors as negative? Are these considered aggressive? So I think they have major challenge in North American zoos where aggressive elephants are deemed socially incompetent. After that, they may be socially isolated for a large portion of the time.
Yeah, so I based it on so I based the ethogram on information in the literature, and I also based it on, I worked on a project before my PhD with lots of elephant researchers, and sort of based it as well on the ethogram that we designed as part of that study. And the kind of the negative behaviors, sort of hitting and kicking and things like that were recorded because we considered them to be like a kind of, I mean, potentially it's a disciplinary behavior, but it's still a kind of a negative interaction. The like the negative non-physical interactions that were kind of coming about as displacement and things, we grouped them as negative behaviors based on the reaction of the receiving elephant. So if the receiving elephant was not kind of fazed by the interaction and would just, you know, like, or the approach of the elephant, we considered that was fine for them and how they perceived it to be. And then if they were kind of then moving away, we sort of perceived it as they weren't comfortable staying in that situation. And I guess that was to kind of grasp, if you've got an elephant that's constantly, relentlessly, you know, being displaced or having something taken away from it almost, there's a potential that that animal's then going to be sort of experiencing not such a great time, because it's like, oh, I got the treat, oh, the treat's gone, you know, and that sort of repetition. So it's kind of, they sort of came about as trying to understand how the receiving elephant might be sort of experiencing the environment, basically.
I think Brian has a small follow-up. He's asking if those negative behaviors you just talked about inappropriate, if they support social cohesiveness.
So I think sort of definitely kind of sort of displacement behaviors, and also even you know, like sort of hitting or kicking or whatever. It's a, you know, it might be like a reach out and a smack kind of don't do that sort of behavior. And actually I think, yeah, it's really important. So to me, the presence of physical aggression like that is completely fine, because it's kind of like arguing with your siblings, you know. There has to be a point that animals can sort of say, you know, no, I don't like this, or this isn't working for me, to another animal. So it would be the presence of excessive aggression that would then be kind of, okay, you know, maybe there's an issue, but we didn't see excessive aggression in this study.
Thanks. So Alessia is asking, she was wondering, do you think that personality may also be linked to the performance of repetitive behaviors?
Oh, I don't know, actually. It's not something that I looked into. Again, we didn't see a huge amount of repetitive behaviors in the elephants that we were looking at. I suppose because obviously repetitive behaviors are coming from a kind of a potentially coming from a past situation, you know, there is the potential that different animals, you know, have had different experiences that have shaped their personality in different ways, that have also caused them to engage in repetitive behaviors. But yeah, I mean, the honest answer is I don't know, but that's interesting to think about.
And Christian is asking, you briefly mentioned it for the personality traits already, but can you tell us more about whether some relationships differ depending on whether the individual was the sender and the receiver of an interaction? For example, during non-physical negative interactions, but also for initiating play behaviors, etc.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know is the answer. Sorry. Yeah, I did look at kind of dyadic interactions, but I didn't look at sort of personality. I looked at personality within the dyads in terms of seeing how sociable they were, but I didn't look at how that related to like individual behaviors like that. But that would definitely be something. I feel like coming out of this, I want to go back and look a lot more at the personality side of stuff and really drill down into the individual adjectives. So hopefully at some point I'll have that answer.
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of very interesting questions in your data. So another one from Laura, and she was asking, when you say that you want to study whether compatibility is more important than group or how they interact, have you thought about comparing it with the size of the elephants living in the wild? She thinks that may be interesting.
As in like the size of the groups? Is that?
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it would be interesting to see, you know, if we look at the wild, you know, if we look at the wild groups. I mean, wild groups really range in size from quite small to quite large, and they're affected by lots of different things. So yeah, it would be interesting to see how they match up with the wild as well.
And another question from Nicole. Do you think that any of the factors that you found to improve positive behaviors would be useful in helping a situation where you have an elephant who's displaying some negative behaviors? For example, if you have an elephant who's being troublesome, would you recommend adding a few calves or moving them to a larger group?
Yeah, gosh, I mean, I think the answer is it's not as easy as that, unfortunately. But I think I kind of feel like if you've got stuff like that and it's, you know, you've reached these kind of irreparable differences and you want to be looking at moving an elephant away, say, I think it would be really nice to be able to understand definitely, you know, what would be the perfect social group for that elephant, you know, based on what it's doing, based on how it's behaving. I mean, I suppose to some extent keepers know this anyway, you know, so if you've got a kind of an elephant that's maybe been a little bit boisterous, you might want to send it to a group that, you know, it's kind of going to be sort of either put in its place almost, or, you know, or it can be kind of the top dog, as it were, to sort of stop that kind of internal fight. But yeah, I don't think as it stands, I don't think you could answer that kind of question, but it would be really nice to reach a point where we can.
Yeah, I think there's so many still interesting subjects there. So we don't have currently more questions in the chat box. But yeah, if oh, there's another one from Emily. So Emily was asking, through analyzing the videos, did you notice a generalized fight zone size for elephants, or does it depend on more on the personality of the approaching elephant to the one that will be displaced?
It seemed to depend on the individuals involved. So some of them would maybe just take 1 or 2 steps, and the other elephant had to get kind of quite close to them, whereas in others they would be kind of, you know, one elephant would start walking towards them and they'd kind of side eye it and then be off down the enclosure. So I think it was a really individual thing, and again that's probably highly linked to so what experiences they've had in the past and how kind of solid, I guess, they are as an animal, you know, and how kind of well-rounded they are.
So I think we currently don't have any. Okay, Brian has another one. So Brian was suggesting that for future research, he suggests that to look at coordinated behavior as opposed to proximity. And he thinks that elephant proximity can be dictated by the size of the environment in which they are housed. So we would expect to see greater proximity in an indoor group habitat than outdoors.
Yeah. So what I wanted to look at with the proximity was, I mean, I wanted to look at whether elephants were kind of within a group with one another. It's really hard to quantify, and actually this is why I collected the data and I didn't put it into my PhD because I was concerned it wasn't solid enough for my Viva. Is like, you know, can you kind of describe an elephant of being within group if it's within a certain percentage of the enclosure, you know, so that you don't get inflation in terms of proximity within indoor enclosures when they are smaller.
Thanks. And I'm not sure. Yeah, the questions keep popping up, but yeah, thanks again, Ellen, for the very interesting talk. I think all the questions just showed that yeah, we're really interested in the talk, and then there's still so many interesting topics within this subject. So if everyone has any more questions, please feel free to come back to our Slack workspace, and then we can continue our discussion there. And so thanks again, Ellen. In 2 weeks' time, Monday, 8th of June, we will have Sarah Hintz talking about an activity in fattening cattle. So that will be our first talk about cattle. Do join us again. And just a reminder that if you want to become a speaker, our application is still live. So you can just use the Google form to apply or get in touch with me, Christian, Rachel, or Laura, and then you can find us on Slack workspace. So Ellen's talk was recorded and will be put on our Slack workspace, so you can come back to it later. I want to just take this opportunity to thank Ellen again for speaking to us, and then thanks everyone for joining us today. I will see you in 2 weeks' time.
Great, thanks
Thanks,
very much.
Ellen. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.